Hello, my name is Caitlin Wolf, and I will be reporting on the Wisconsin Historical Museum in Madison, Wisconsin. I'd first like to show you a picture of the actual building, which is located on the left, and on the right is a picture of looking out through the museum's windows at the Madison Capitol building. I think this really shows its excellent location and how accessible it is for many people to visit. My overall experience during the museum biography was very eye-opening and also very useful. I found a lot of the things we learned and discussed throughout the readings was very relevant and practical in the field today. I especially found my interview with a museum professional to be very useful. It was very unexpected, but very honest, and I really appreciated my museum professional showing me a realistic picture of the museum field today. But first I want to start off with the museum description. I spent a lot of time focused on the website to gather most of my information before observing. The website is very clearly focused on the museum's mission, which is to tell the history of the state of Wisconsin. This was shown through many different pages throughout the website. Many pages were emphasized on the collections, including little tidbits about the history. Curators would include their favorite objects and stories. So it really created a welcoming environment that was focused on the mission. In addition to focusing on the mission, the website placed a lot of emphasis on community events. For example, they have an events calendar that highlighted multiple events in the upcoming months. Not only that, they placed a lot of emphasis on education through field trips, and there was extensive information about planning a field trip, what you could learn, specific tours, etc. So the museum's website is really approaching communicating their message through a lot of the ways that Anderson talks about in reinventing the museum. The museum has a clear statement of its mission and also focuses heavily on being a community center. Next, I'd like to start with my museum observations, beginning with the exhibits and collections I saw. I want to start with the first floor. It was a very interesting experience. The museum chose to leave most of the space open, which I later found out was to serve for a community space. The museum held all of their events and programs in this space. It also included a movie theater, which I never could find any information of what they showed there. But instead, for the first floor, the museum dedicated it to showing maps of Wisconsin and used the wall to tell that story, therefore leaving a lot of open space. As I moved throughout the other floors, however, I found a more traditional feel to a museum. It was definitely similar to the lecture that Dr. Latham gave for the document-centered museum. The way that these objects were presented really gave the feel that they were the basis to many of, not all of the activities of the museum. Programs were based upon them, field trips were based around them, and they were used to tell the story of Wisconsin. One of the first types of exhibit is the one shown here, in which many objects were put together to create a scene from the past. When objects were put together to create this kind of scene, I found a lot of what I would call infographics, which are shown on the left. I found this to be a very effective way of communicating information. It almost worked as bulleted points, and the words were broken up with images, so it really helped to communicate enough information to visitors without being too overwhelming. Another type of exhibit was shown here, in which statues were used to recreate a scene, such as the political era of Wisconsin shown here. In addition to just having these statues with some information on an infographic, this one had an audio button which you could press, and each person would talk and speak their part, replaying an event within the political history of Wisconsin. I found this to be very engaging and a good way to break up all of the information given through word. The next type of exhibit the museum had was an interactive exhibit in which encouraged visitors to walk in, to touch, to see objects, and to really get the feeling of what life was like back in each time period that the museum represented. I thought this was a really great idea and another way to engage visitors and really help them experience what life might be like. As I was walking around looking at each exhibit, I also noticed that music was playing depending on which area of the exhibits I was in. For example, in the Native American um, exhibits, I heard typical nature sounds such as birds chirping, as well as Native American flute being played. The same was true for the circus exhibit. Typical circus music was playing as I viewed the objects. This was also a great way to reinforce the objects, to make the objects come alive, and not have them feel so static, but that you were actually in that time period, viewing life how it was. This is the last exhibit that I wanted to highlight. It's Wisconsin Innovations, and it featured different objects that were invented or the idea came from someone from Wisconsin. And I thought this was another way that reinforced how committed the museum was to Wisconsin history, but also how object-centered the museum was. Next, I want to talk about the more, I guess you could say, aggressive ways the museum encouraged interaction between objects, exhibits, and visitors. Throughout many of the exhibits, there were try this, please open, and this was such a great way to get visitors to really interact with the objects and once again reinforce how different time periods were Wisconsin. Next, the museum also included many forms of digital interaction, such as the TV shown on the left, which would highlight and talk about the specific collections it was located near. And on the right is a picture of an interactive kiosk that would take you through modules learning about different events throughout Wisconsin history. This was another type of display that was included in many exhibits that I found to be very engaging for visitors. It related a lot to Kelly's article about visitors and learning, and I thought that it enforced what visitors were learning, but also asked them to apply it to their own lives, making it very memorable and very personal for the visitor. At the very end of the tour, I found this display that engaged visitors asking for their feedback. For example, one of the questions you could answer was, what was a better job, a lumberjack or lead miner? And then you could post your own response on this paperclip, or clothesline rather, display. This was interesting because it gave visitors almost an ownership in asking to see what personally relates to them, but it was also effective as a museum professional because you're able to get feedback of what your community really wants to see. I now quickly want to talk about the museum wayfinding system and staff. A very positive aspect of this museum was the directory provided on each stairwell and each elevator. It provided a clear path for all visitors. Also on each level, the museum provided a Through Their Eyes tour guide, which directed visitors to specific objects and asked them to read the history, but then relate it to their life. For example, it talked about children's lives in the early 1900s and then asked them to compare it to their own lives, which once again creates a memorable and personal experience. I wanted to talk about signage between each collection. Many different collections were thrown together on one floor with no little or no signage separating. On the left there is the Wisconsin Innovation signs, and I had just come from the circus exhibit, and there really was um, no separation. And at first I missed this sign, so that was one drawback to the museum. And also, what I also want to talk about is on this top floor, Wisconsin Innovations, a 1990s living room and kitchen, as shown on the right, and a circus display were all thrown together in one. So while they were all representing different time periods, it really didn't seem logical in the order. As for staff, there was very little staff visible. Only the information desk clerk and gift shop workers were there. The front desk worker rarely welcomed or addressed guests, which I thought took away from the friendliness that I found on the website. And I could not find any signs of the curators or where they were located. Moving on to the interview. I interviewed the curator of domestic life, which I later found out is no longer the curator of domestic life, but rather they are moving towards more general responsibilities for everyone. I just want to highlight a couple things. He mentioned that he disliked the name curator and found it too formal and wanted to move towards a more informal and welcoming job title. I want to focus on his career at the Wisconsin Historical Museum. Currently, the staff is brainstorming ways to rename the museum so it does not include the word museum, which would, they feel, engage the community more and destroy those stereotypes that may discourage people from coming to museums. He talked about how this position has limited his aspirations and goals within the field, mostly because of a lack of team collaboration and therefore lack of innovation and creativity. Um, One of the reasons for this is funding, and he found that as their budgets get smaller, the museum staff is willing to do less and less. And I really admired this honest perspective because I think it may be a reality in many museums across the country. When we talked about the future of museums, he honestly told me it looks a little challenging, especially when we talked about funding. With smaller budgets, he felt that increased privatization would be a problem, and that we need to find leadership and emerging museum professionals if we are to become creative and innovative. He also did say, though, that those that will thrive will become more of the event and community centers. I found this interview to be fascinating, and really this very short time does not do justice to the hour and a half that we discussed the future of museums. When I look back at the entire experience of my museum biography, I found it to be really fascinating. I generally really liked the collections and the museums, even though it might have been a little more traditional or a little less on the creative side. I thought that it effectively communicated the history of Wisconsin to its visitors. The biggest critique was more staff interaction for a more friendly experience. Researching the external factors on the museum website and doing the observation helped to show the significant strengths of this museum, while the internal interview helped to show probably common struggles throughout many museums. But putting this all together, it was a great way to show the complexity of museums. Overall, this assignment has helped me understand and appreciate museums much more.